All right, Auto 2, we're going to begin today with a demonstration on checking oil pressure and confirming gauge readings. So here I have a good known oil pressure gauge. It's got a fitting here, so I've got two different sizes that could be used for checking pressure. And this gauge I know is accurate. It's been tested many times and tested recently, so we call this a good known gauge. And just in support of our discussion on lubrication, we want to look at the gauge reading and see where it is and then talk about where it should be. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll start inside the car here. So here we are inside the car, and I'm going to go ahead and show you the dash. So I'll bring the camera up here and let you look at the dash there. I'm going to go ahead and turn the lights on, so there's a little backlighting on the dash. So we want to pay attention to this oil pressure gauge over here. You can see by the tachometer that the engine's not running. I'm going to go ahead and start it now, so here we go. And we're going to watch where that oil pressure gauge goes. So the engine RPM came right up to about, roughly 1200 RPM. That oil pressure gauge is sitting, this one's sitting, it went up towards the middle and now it's settling down a little bit. The engine oil is thick and cold, or thick because it's cold. So we expect the pressure to be a little higher, but when it's hotter, we'll see where it is. So what I think I'll do right now is shut the car off. So remember, that's about a needle width below the center line there. I'm going to shut the car off, and when we go out here to check the oil pressure, we're going to say, okay, the engine oil is relatively cold at the moment. Let me go ahead and pop the hood here. So right there is our hood pop right there. And our plate here on the side of on the door jamb tells us that this is, sorry if I can get it on there. Here's the VIN. If I can get it to focus. Okay, we're struggling to focus. But anyways, what we've got here is, this is an 03 of 05 Toyota Tundra with a 4.7 liter engine. So I'll set this down here for just a moment. You can kind of watch what I'm doing. I'm going to go ahead and pop the hood. There's the secondary latch right there. So look up at it just a little bit. There's the secondary latch right there. See? Okay. So the question becomes, where is that oil pressure sending unit on this engine? So most oil pressure sending units are, I'm going to kind of look over here. Most oil pressure sending units are close to the oil filter, etc. So what I'm going to do on the screen here is I'm going to go ahead and go to, I think what I'll do is I'll go to, and I'll show you how to do this in just a moment, but I'm going to go to Mitchell Pro Demand, and I'm going to go to electrical component locator. So I'll ID the vehicle, go to electrical component locator, and see where, and look and see where the sender is. So I think what I'll do is pause the video. I'll record a video screen sharing so you can see me walking through that process, and then I'll continue the video. So let's do that. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I should be recording the screen here, is I'm going to go to my Mitchell Pro Demand icon and bring up Pro Demand and hit login. It automatically will put in our username and password, which you have in Google Classroom. And I'm going to go ahead and ID this vehicle. So I'm going to go up here to a 2005 Toyota, and it's a Tundra. and it is a 4.7 liter, and that VIN T means the 8th digit of the VIN code is a T, and it's an SR5. That's just the trim level. It is an extra cab. It's what they call an access cab. It has the suicide doors, not the full rear doors. It is four-wheel drive. So I'm going to hit use this vehicle. All right. Now, there's a number of things I can look at. And right up here on the search bar, there's a spot that says component locations. If I went to service manual, I would go to electrical, and then it would show me component locations. Let's go straight to component locations and click on electrical component locator. Now we're going to go to sending units and sensors. And now we're going to go down to oil pressure. So oil pressure sender 4.7. Now it says access and standard cab or double cab. We have an access cab. Standard cab is no extended cab with an 8-foot bed. Access cab is the suicide doors with a 6.5-foot bed. The double cab is the full rear doors, non-suicide. It says here on lower left front of engine, and it says see figure, lower left front of engine. Let's go on this picture and let's blow this thing up. Sorry. Let's blow this thing up, and let's go over here, and we will go down to this legend and see where oil pressure switch is. There it is. It says O2. So we're going to go look at O2, and there it is right there, O2 right there. But it's not giving us the clearest description. This is the radiator right here. You can see the radiator cap, and it says it's right there. There's the air snorkel. It's hard to tell how far down on the front of the engine is, but we know it's on the driver's side, left front. Remember, we're taking all orientation as if you're sitting inside the driver's seat. So on the driver's side front, lower. Okay, so we're going to go look for this, and I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll do that. All right, so here we go. You can see I've got the camera underneath the car, and this is the oil filter right here where I've got my mouse. And right next to the oil filter, this sort of silver, it's actually a round can, is the sending unit. What you're looking at here, we're looking from the bottom. This is the fan, this is the fan shaft, this is the bottom of the radiator, this is the training cooler mounting there. You can see the AC compressor right here. You can see the power steering pulley over there. And here's the crankshaft harmonic balancer. So right here. So I'm going to go underneath, and you're going to see me. I'll have a little bit of light down there, and you're going to see me first unscrew that, unplug that sending unit, and then unscrew that sending unit. The lighting will change slightly because of my headlamp. So I'm going to go ahead and squeeze on this guy if I can. Let's see how it goes there. Looks like it's two-sided. And see if I'm struggling a little bit to figure out. There it is. So I had to push on this side right here on that tab right there, and then it unplugged. So I'll take my 14 millimeter wrench on the base. I'm going to go counterclockwise and loosen this guy. This is going to be a pipe thread, which means it's tapered, meaning as it goes in, it gets tighter and tighter. So I just got to, when I go to tighten it, I'll tighten it just till it snugs up. And we'll put some Teflon tape on the threads when we go back in to help it to seal in the small gaps that are in the threads. So I'm going to get some oil out. I expect, I don't know, maybe a cup of oil. I'm going to make sure my leads for the camera are out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and unscrew this by hand. So here it comes. And you'll see some oil gush out of there. So you know this is an engine performance test. Of course, my rags weren't in the right spot, but now they are. You know this is an engine performance test. And I'm doing this in this case under the guidance of, or at least under the auspices of looking at lubrication system. And so here's the sending unit with its little 1/8 inch pipe threads. And we don't know what kind of shape it's in, but remember our needle during cold was right about a line width below the middle line. So now I'm going to take my adapter off because I'm matching up the correct threads here for that sending unit. And I'm going to go ahead and put this right in there and carefully start threading it in. Now it doesn't go in very far. I'm just going to kind of snug it. And if everything goes well when I start it, we will see the pressure go up. So I'm going to go ahead and start the car and then hold this up so you guys can see the gauge. You'll start screaming at me if you see it gushing oil because I didn't get it tight enough or something, but I think we're okay. So I'm going inside the car and I'm going to start the car and we'll see how it does. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this case, let me shut off my headlamp and talk to you for just a second. So while this engine is warming up, you can hear it, I believe, we see that we're at 60 psi. You might have heard that high-pitched squeal and then the noise went away. This thing has an air injection pump that's pumping fresh air into the exhaust manifold. It's actually under the intake manifold, and it only does that during cold start. Comes on for 30 seconds and then it shuts off. So I'm going to pause the video, let this thing get to full operating temperature. We'll look at the gauge again, but we noticed it was at 60 psi. So we're going to say that middle line is right about 60 psi, or maybe a line width below. Once it gets hot, we'll read the pressure, and then we'll put the sending unit back in and see what it is on the dash. Does that make sense? Hope so. So let me pause this. So I just want to show you that I'm heating this thing up right now using the pedal depressor down under the throttle, and we're running at about 2200 RPM. The gauge is reading 0 because we've got it unplugged. But I just want you to see the pedal depressor going down there under the throttle. So we'll give it a good 10 to 15 minute warm up. Okay, so we're going to take back up with our looking now that the engine's been running a full 15 minutes. Upper radiator hose is nice and hot, so we know the thermostat's open. We'll look at the temp gauge, and the temp gauge is showing, sorry, there it is over there, just a little below the middle line. So and we'll talk about temperature later. Let's go under the car. Let's look at the gauge here. So we're at a hot idle. We're showing about 20 psi. So a hot idle of about 20 psi in our engine RPM, just to kind of check it, is right around, we're going to call it about 700 RPM. So a hot idle speed at 700 RPM of about 20 psi. So what I'm going to do is take this oil pressure sending unit. There's a little bit of sealer on the threads there. I'm going to take my Teflon tape and I'm going to go ahead and wind some Teflon tape onto this fitting. Now if I wind it this way, when I thread that in, it's going to unwind. So I want to put the Teflon tape on in such an orientation that when I go ahead, I'm going to go around several times and then I just break it off. I'm going to make sure that there's no Teflon tape in there that would block the little hole. Just make sure it's off the edge. The idea of the Teflon tape is that it helps to seal the threads as it goes in. It takes up some of the space. If I can get it to focus on my hand there. See, there it goes. So it takes up some of the space between the threads. So I'm going to go thread this in. I'm going to take the camera down with you. I'm going to put my headlamp on to give a little bit of extra lighting so you can kind of see what's going on. And I'll show you how we'll thread that in. So here we go down there. And it is a 14 millimeter. Sorry for the wobbly. You can see my gauge hanging down, and I'm going to go ahead and get it up in there. Okay. So I'll point this guy up so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to go up in there and unthread this hose, and the hose comes right out, and there's a bunch of oil gushing out. You can see how much thinner it is because the engine's hot. And so I'm going to go ahead and thread this in there. One thing that's kind of a bummer is I got the plug all oily. That's kind of a bummer. So I'll have to wipe that all off, this plug. So I'm going to take my 14 millimeter wrench and snug that up. I'm not going to go crazy because it's a pipe thread. And I don't want to, I can snap this fitting off if I go too tight. If I'm too loose, it'll leak. So I'm gently snugging this in, not trying real hard. And then I'll have to clean up my whole mess here. We're going to do a timing belt and water pump. We're going to do a radiator on this truck. So we'll have a chance to get things out of here and clean it up better. But for now, we're just snugging this guy in. We want him snug enough that it's not going to go anywhere, but it's obviously not going to break off either. So this sending unit appears to be reading reasonably well. Cold at about 1200 RPM and 60 PSI. The gauge was about a needle width below the center. Okay, we're starting to get pretty snug here. I'm not trying hard, but I am getting it snug. Okay, and one last little snug here. Okay, that's good and snug. So now I'm going to take a rag and wipe off this plug. Unfortunately, I got a bunch of oil in there. I think I'll take some electrical contact cleaner and spray that out. So I'll pause the video and do that. Okay, so what you can see down in there is that I didn't have any electrical contact cleaner, so I just used Chem Tool and I sprayed the contact and the connector out. And you can see the connector, I've got it plugged back in there. And it's threaded back in, and I took my cloth rag and I did my best to wipe everything down and get all the excess oil up. And there's some still leaking down over there and in the frame, and we'll have to take care of that. But what I want you to notice, let me shut my headlamp off here. Get that off, and also headlights of the car are on. But what we're going to do now is, now that that's back in, we're going to go inside the car and run it and see where it is on the gauge at a hot idle of 20 PSI. So here we go. I've got this on here, and I'm going to start this up. So there's our oil pressure gauge going up over there. And it's going to about, it's idling at about 750 RPM. And I'd say that that gauge is right about that first line. So that first line's about 20 PSI. So a hot idle at about 750 RPM is 20 PSI. Watch when I take the throttle up. Let's see where it goes. Up to 2500. So it's reading about halfway between the first line and the second line at about 2,000 RPM. And on the gauge, I didn't show it to you, but that was about 37 PSI. So about 20 there, about 37 in the middle, and close to 60 right up at that middle line. All right, let's go ahead and shut it off. So we've got, what we've done now is we've essentially calibrated the gauge. So we know where the gauge is, both hot and cold. So we can have some confidence when we look at the pressure gauge on this thing. And we know what the pressure actually is because there's no numbers on that gauge on the dash. So the other thing you've learned is something about finding a sending unit with a Mitchell Protoman electronic component locator. How to take it out, how to deal with pipe threads with Teflon tape, how to get it threaded back in, be real careful not to over tighten. The threads don't go all the way in because they're tapered, meaning they get larger as you go in. All right, so there you go. That's how we check oil pressure on a car, confirm the gauge, and take out the sending unit. If it was for a warning light, it would just be a much, much smaller bodied sending unit. And some cars are really hard to get to and take out and check. This one's pretty easy. All right, sounds good, guys.